If you know anything about Bill Belichick, people are wondering, how is it possible that this woman, 24 years old, how is it that she has managed to accomplish in a relatively short time what none of these professional athletes could do, what no member of the media could do, what Tom Brady could not do? Change Bill Belichick. Conquer Bill Belichick. Now let's move on to Russia. Russian experts in the West have generally been wrong, spectacularly wrong, in trying to understand Russia. And you see, in the Western mind, freedom is peace, it's stability, it's happiness. To the Russian mind, freedom means chaos. Freedom means the kind of anarchy that they're seeing in the West. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And today we are doing a part 2 of our series on the Russia-Ukraine war, how we got involved, what is the history leading up to this cataclysmic event. But before we get there, I just want to say a few words about this viral video of Bill Belichick, the Super Bowl winning coach, with his girlfriend, Jordan Hudson, in their CBS morning interview. Now, by this time, this has been circulating for quite a while, and there continues to be a lot of steam, a lot of interest behind this. And I want to make a couple of comments here that are a bit out of the mainstream of what is being said as it relates to this particular interview. I mean, there's so much fascination, with the fact that you have Bill Belichick, who is 49 years older than his girlfriend. She's 24, he's 73. But there's something here from a biblical point of view that I think can be, the Bible has something to say about everything, every aspect of life. If life is a pie chart, human existence is represented by a pie chart. There's no sliver of that pie that the Bible has nothing to say. So I believe it was the 19th century statesman, theologian Abraham Kuyper who said that Jesus Christ looks at every square inch of human existence and he points to it and he says, that's mine. So meaning that Scripture has something relevant to say about education, about music, about entertainment, about marriage, about love, about you name it. The Bible has something relevant to say about it. And it has something relevant to offer us here too, which may surprise you. I'm fascinated by the dynamic. Lawrence Fox and I were discussing this on, my other show, our other show, WTF, World of Taunton and Fox, which you can catch here on my channel. And we were discussing this just a little bit, just from the standpoint of, it's somewhat humorous. But I do want to offer a little bit more as it relates to this. Now, if you're not familiar with who Bill Belichick is, Bill Belichick is a legendary football coach, American football coach. He was Tom Brady's coach for all but one of Tom Brady's Super Bowl victories. Bill Belichick coached the New England Patriots to 10 Super Bowls and won 6. Now that's pretty incredible. That has not been equaled by any other coach. And he has a reputation for being hard-nosed, no-nonsense, a curmudgeonly control freak. This is a guy who many were afraid of, whether it's assistant coaches or players, members of the media were afraid of this guy. He was notorious for coming into his press conferences and radiating disdain for the media for the fact that he didn't want to be there and giving one-word answers. Answers where he's talking like this very deliberately because he's not interested and he doesn't want to be there. And yet, here he is. This is a guy who wouldn't let Tom Brady, after Brady had won with him multiple Super Bowl victories, He wouldn't let Brady bring his personal trainer to practice or to games. Belichick's line on that was, not part of the team, can't be here. That's not going to happen. This was a guy who team owner Robert Kraft couldn't change. Tried to get him to change his offense or to change some of his recruiting, or rather his drafting philosophy. Couldn't get Bill Belichick to change. Even this billionaire owner couldn't do it. This was a guy that dumped Tim Tebow because he said he didn't want the distraction of Tim Tebow, which made sense. I mean, Tim Tebow was going to be a backup to Brady. It wasn't going to be the starter. He just decided, look, he's not worth it. I don't want the media circus that comes with him. This is who Bill Belichick is here. And this is a guy who benched Malcolm Butler, who made an interception in the closing seconds of a game against the Seattle Seahawks where it looked like the New England Patriots were sure to lose. They were going to lose the Super Bowl. But Malcolm Butler made an interception in the closing seconds of the game to secure the victory for Bill Belichick, Tom Brady, and the New England Patriots. Belichick benched him for a later Super Bowl because of a kerfuffle, an argument with an assistant coach. Decided, nope, not having that. You're benched. This is the Bill Belichick we're talking about in this interview. Watch this.
Do you feel like you were treated with dignity and respect when you were let go by Robert Kraft?
Yeah, well, it was a mutual decision for us to part ways.
He said fired.
It was a mutual decision.
The other change for Belichick is 24-year-old Jordan Hudson, his creative muse, as he writes in his book.
Make sure that that's the philosophy.
Jordan was a constant presence during our interview.
You have Jordan right over there. Everybody in the world seems to be following this relationship. They've got an opinion about your private life. It's got nothing to do with them, but they're invested in it. How do you deal with that?
Never been too worried about what everybody else thinks. Just try to do what I feel like is best for me and what's right.
How did you guys meet?
Not talking about this.
No?
No.
It's a topic neither one of them is comfortable commenting on, though Hudson has recently posted about it on Instagram.
You joined InstaFace, as you put it. I love that. There's some great pictures of you and Jordan, where you're a fisherman and she's a mermaid. It's charming. It's a different side of you. What's the reaction been like?
What's it been like?
To have these different sort of photos. There's another one where you're doing, I know you're not into meditation or yoga or Pilates. You're balancing Jordan on your feet, and she's doing kind of the Titanic pose.
Yeah, so I'm on some of those social media platforms, but I honestly don't follow them.
What he does follow isn't clicks or views, but touchdowns and, above all, wins.
You do seem like you're having a lot more fun these days than you were in other chapters of your life, let's say.
I enjoy football. I enjoy the whole process of it. It's hard to win, and it's hard to beat other good coaches, good teams. I appreciate the grind. I appreciate the competition. But coaching's fun, and honestly, I feel like I haven't worked a day in my life.
Now, this is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's really, really quite fascinating. Because if you know anything about Bill Belichick, the things that I've just said to you, people are wondering, how is it possible that this woman, 24 years old, Jordan Hudson is her name. She's a kind of an online influencer. She's been his girlfriend fairly briefly. How is it that she has managed to accomplish in a few months, and my guess is probably in a few hours, at most a few days, but we're just now seeing it. How is it that she has managed to accomplish in a relatively short time what none of these professional athletes could do, what no member of the media could do, what billionaire owner Robert Kraft could not do, what the NFL could not do, what Tom Brady could not do? Change Bill Belichick. conquer Bill Belichick. How is that possible? Well, here's what the Bible has to say on even a situation like this that offers us just a little bit of insight, and that's this. God has designed men and women very differently. Through the whole Me Too thing, what we were hearing constantly is that women have no agency. They're just victims of powerful men. They have no agency, no ability to make choices of their own. And this is why the Me Too movement, in many respects, and I'm not talking about the genuine aspects of that, where there were women who were actually raped and thus didn't have any agency. But in those instances, Me Too often took very little interest in that. I mean, for instance, in the UK with the Rotherham scandal, roughly 19,000 British girls, and now it's estimated to be, more like 250,000 British white girls who were being sexually assaulted by Muslim men. Me Too wasn't interested in that. They were much more interested in Meghan Markle, that somehow she was a victim. They weren't interested in actual adolescent girls who were victims. But the narrative that we're hearing here in the United States was frequently women were portrayed as having no agency. They had no choice. They're just victims of powerful men. Now, what the Bible demonstrates for us, and of course, even just everyday life, if you've been paying attention and you have any life experience at all, is that men and women exercise power, they exercise influence very differently. So men are, on average, this is why the whole, men and women's bathrooms thing or women's sports doesn't work. Men are, on average, twice as strong as the average woman. They have roughly 1/3 more lung capacity than the average woman. It's why somebody who's, a mediocre swimmer on the men's side, Leah Thompson, could just demolish NCAA records for women once he declared himself to be a woman. I mean, he's just doing laps, because he's far stronger. He has a great deal more lung capacity. He just keep going. And whereas women, couldn't compete with that. So there are massive physical differences. I have seen recently a video circulating online where a woman slaps her boyfriend and he backhands her and she flies across the room. It's actually quite frightening. And I couldn't help thinking to myself, we will see more and more of this type of thing as girls are taught, as young women are taught, that they are just as powerful physically, as men. And all of a sudden, they discover that they aren't when they get into a physical altercation, with a man who's prepared to be aggressive in retaliation, which was the case here. So we'll see more of that as women are being taught it, but also as men are being taught that women are the same as men. So we know that physically, anyone with any sense knows that physically they are not the same. There's no comparison to be made. So there's a difference in that regard between men and women. And men are by nature, tend to be, protectors, defenders. But women exercise power in another way, and that is that they can assert it via influence. Now, that influence can be a wicked influence, or it can be a very positive influence. A good wife is a positive influence on her husband, not because, he's henpecked, not because she's leading him around by the nose, but because she cares for him and because she wants him to make wise judgments. So we see that in Scripture. So we anybody who has paid attention at all, this idea that women have no agency and thus are victims of men. Anyone who's seen Meghan and Harry knows that that's a lie. You know, Harry was apparently something of a war hero in Afghanistan. I mean, bit of an alpha male. Look at him now. She has reduced him. She has reduced him to milquetoast, to beta status. That is. She has absolutely castrated him. She wears his testicles as, as earrings. I mean, that's what she has done to him. So we see the negative influence, and we're seeing it in this interview. We see a man who is an alpha male who has dominated other men in his own sport, in his own field, his own profession. Just like that, he has been reduced to kind of beta status. There are jokes going around that, he looks like someone who is a, what shall I say? He's like a captive of sorts. I don't know if how many of you would be old enough to remember Senator Jeremiah Denton from the state of Alabama, but he very famously in Vietnam was a captive of the Vietnamese and was forced to do an interview where he was stating that he was being well treated and he was blinking SOS. He was doing Morse code with his eyelids. You want to say, Bill Belichick, if you are being held captive, do a Jeremiah Denton for us. I mean, just blink SOS for us and we'll send help for you. But this is an example of power, of influence, feminine power being exercised negatively in its sexual power that is being exercised here. Bill Belichick is giving himself a pass to behave like this when he wouldn't have tolerated it from any one of his players, from any one of his coaches. But this is where we are, and you see it happening this quickly. So you have a Jezebel's in Scripture, you have Delilah's in Scripture, very negative portrayals of women who are exercising power, sexual power, over the men in their lives. Ahab, in the case of Jezebel and Samson, very physically powerful man, the most powerful man of his day, physically, but she conquered him. Just like that. And it was via sexual power. But we also see it exercised positively through figures like Ruth, through figures like Mary, Elizabeth, Esther. These are figures these are wives through whom they exercised a godly influence on their husbands and steered them in the right direction that they should go, or affirmed them in the directions that they should go. They were very supportive of their husbands. So I just wanted to point this out because here we are, a few years removed from the whole Me Too movement, where again and again women were portrayed. And by the way, there's nothing feminist about the Me Too movement. It actually is a setback for the Me Too movement because on the one hand, feminists want to argue that women are very powerful. And yet the Me Too movement said, no, they have no power at all, zero. Unable to make any choices for themselves because they are just victims of powerful men. And yet here we are watching, it's astonishing, a man who is rich, powerful, famous, has 49 years more life experience than his girlfriend, and she rules him. We're being told that she's to be copied on all coaching emails. He's a coach at the University of North Carolina now. That all of the emails to him she's to be copied on. She is offering her. She's now at practices. These kinds of things. It's extraordinary. So I just wanted to offer that little insight to you as you pay attention to the extraordinary dynamics that are taking place there, because God has created men and women differently, and the dynamic, it's a beautiful and it's a wonderful dynamic when it works the way God intended it to work, that men and women are exercising influence, exercising power differently. But boy, when you twist it, when you pervert it, it can really take on a really, really awful kind of look. Now let's move on to Russia. We're in our part 2 of this series talking about Russia. And I want to give you, as I'm moving towards discussing Vladimir Putin and who he is, I have finished 4 biographies of Putin, kind of the ones that are getting. I deliberately chose the ones that are getting most of the media attention and positive reviews at places like the New York Times and the New Yorker and elsewhere. So those biographies that people are saying, this is it. And I'm looking forward to demonstrating to you how they disagree on key points of Putin's life. But I think we're able to put together a rough sketch that I hope is accurate as to who he is. But as we're building to that, I wanted to take a little bit of time today, and some of you are old enough to remember this, and thus this is just kind of a refresher for you, and some of you might not be old enough to know this. But I just want to go down memory lane of the last, 35, 40 years in discussing how we got to the point where we are now. Now, it amazes me that people will go into the YouTube comments, and most of the negative comments that we get on YouTube or elsewhere are posted within minutes of the episode being posted, meaning that the person hasn't watched. They just haven't watched. So they're just responding to a banner, something they think that the episode is going to say, or because they have decided that I'm either pro-Putin or I'm pro-Zelensky or I'm anti-Putin or I'm anti-Zelensky. So I've said this many times, but I'm going to say it again. I don't think there are any good guys in this war. There are only victims. And I should say, and have said, that I think that one of the most nefarious players in this entire war has been the United States, particularly under the Obama administration and, of course, the Biden administration. Thank God there was only one of them. But so I'm not viewing this from the lens of Putin as a good guy. Don't think that. I think Putin is a bad guy, or that I think Zelensky is a good guy. I think Zelensky is a bad guy. I think that Ukraine and Russia are both equally corrupt, and I say that as somebody who's been in both of these countries. I think that where Trump is trying to take this, a peace settlement is the best outcome for everyone involved, the world most of all, because this has the potential to become World War III. And that's not where we want this to go. This is a regional conflict, a regional war that can explode into a general European war. It's what amazes me and fascinates me that the EU and so many EU heads, they want this war. I mean, it's obvious that they want this war. Keir Starmer, Macron, they all are beating the drum. People at the WEF, they're beating the drum for this war. They want this war. Now, part of it is because they have selfish motivation. Ukraine has been the greatest money laundering scam probably in world history. It's a place where billions are being laundered and sent back for globalist causes and back into the pockets of Western politicians, to say nothing of Ukrainian politicians. It's going there as well. But we need to see an end to this war. But in order for us to have a perspective on how we ended up in this war to begin with, let's just back up just a bit. So in part 1 of this series, I was laying out for you, just trying to help you to understand something of the Russian mind. I wasn't trying to portray that in a positive or negative light. Rather, it was my intention simply to show you that there is a difference. I think one of the great errors of judgment that we make, and this is true of people all over the world, but American foreign policy has been characterized historically by 2 assumptions that are erroneous. One of them is that other people in the world think the way we do. It's natural for us to think that, but you would hope people in power would know better. So, after 9/11, I can recall that sort of a, how shall I put it? Pardon me. An underlying theme of a lot of the post 9/11 commentary was, if only we could sit down with Osama bin Laden, I'm sure that he would realize that we mean him no harm, that this whole thing was completely unnecessary, and it's just a big misunderstanding. Truman, in his dealings with Stalin, his foreign policy was frequently characterized, FDR before him, same thing, characterized by an assumption that all conflicts are a result of a misunderstanding. And Stalin didn't misunderstand the West. Osama bin Laden did not misunderstand the West, did not misunderstand America. Both understood the West, both understood America very, very well and wanted to destroy it. But if you go into a negotiation with evil people who do really mean you harm under the assumption that, listen, that everyone just acts in their own best interests and not according to some ideological commitment, that can come out pretty badly for you. And what I want to communicate is American foreign policy. Part of what I wanted to communicate in part one for you as a takeaway is that we have often been characterized by this assumption that other people think the way we do. That's one thing. Second thing is that other people want to be Americans. They really just want to be like us. Now, it is true that there are many hundreds of millions of people in the world that that's true of. We see it in the people, who have crossed our open borders. Millions of people who are wanting to come to the United States. But whether they want to be us is, America's not the melting pot, that it once was, and where people came to the United States and adopted American values and loved the Constitution and loved this country. Sometimes there are people who just want to be here because they want the stuff that Americans have, meaning they want to upgrade their quality of life, but they have no desire to integrate. Just look at Dearborn, Michigan. They have no desire to integrate. Indeed, they want to annihilate the existing culture. So there is that element. But the assumption that other people want to be Americans is a dangerous assumption. And it's a very dangerous assumption at a governmental, at a state level when you're talking about negotiating with foreign powers. So I wanted to introduce you in part one to the Russian mind, why it is that Russia's historical experience has produced something very, very different from the American experience, where Russians are very cynical and are accustomed to, Ukrainians as well, to a kind of brutality that Americans aren't. And it's because our historical experience is different. And part of that has to do with, as I explained to you, geography. Please understand the importance of geography in the development of a nation's history, of its society, what it looks like. We truly have been blessed with extraordinary geographic advantages that just the Belgians haven't had, that the Ukrainians haven't had, that the Russians haven't had, the Swiss have had. The English have had because of the English Channel and the Swiss because of the Alps, but the Russians have not had those advantages. So it's produced something different. And as I pointed out, as a result of their geography, as a result of the adoption of Greek Orthodoxy in 988, what happened is that Russia did not experience, whether you think it's positive or negative, I leave it for you to decide, but it developed in two very different ways, the Western experience and the Eastern, the Russian experience, because the Russians did not have a Renaissance. They didn't have a Reformation. They did not have a so-called Enlightenment. They did not have a scientific revolution. They did not have an industrial revolution until 200 years after the Industrial Revolution had begun in the West. It started in England in the 1740s, hit Russia in the 1930s. I mean, think about that. So Russia has been playing catch up. But the Russian mind, the Ukrainian mind as well, because for most of their histories, they've been essentially the same entities. Some people won't like me saying that, but it's a fact. Is different. It is different. But American politicians, Western politicians, Ukrainian politicians know how to package that war to appeal to the Western mind, to appeal to Americans. And that's to say it's a fight for freedom. It's a fight for democracy. Ukraine's never had democracy, not in any meaningful way, nor is Russia. Don't tell me that they have. They haven't. Neither of those countries have ever really been free. They are police states. Right now, they're police states. Zelensky has just canceled elections for the second time. We had elections during the Civil War, during both World Wars. Zelensky cancels them. That's not freedom. That's not democracy. That's not giving people the option to choose who their leaders are in a time of great national disaster and distress. So moving forward, what I would want to remind you of is this, and part of the story is somewhat personal. For me, it's just simply because it tied into where I was going with my own career. There was a time when I was quite young. I was 21 when the Soviet Union began to break apart in 1988. That's when the first satellite states started to pull away from the Soviet Union. So this is when Gorbachev was the Russian premier. They began to break away, and the world was nervous because while on the one hand, the satellite states, Eastern European satellite states breaking away from the Soviet Union was viewed positively because these were freedom movements that were initiating these declarations of independence. The worry, of course, was also that Gorbachev would send the tanks rolling in and that we would have Prague, all over again. We would have a situation where Budapest, we would have a massive suppression, something like Tiananmen Square. We would have a massive suppression of these freedom movements and a kind of bloody outcome. Thank God Gorbachev did not do that. But as these satellite states are breaking away, and then you have in November 9 of 89, you have the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And today it's like that never happened. And young people know very little about it, if they know anything about it. I don't think, I would have to think about this, but I don't think that there has been a more momentous event in my lifetime. Not the moon landing, not 9/11, not the Challenger space shuttle blowing up, not war in Afghanistan, Iraq, not war in Ukraine, Russia. I don't think there's been a more momentous, epoch-defining event than the collapse of the Berlin Wall, than the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then which led ultimately to the reunification of Germany, which had been divided into zones in 1945 at the end of World War II. And the reason I say that is anyone who's old enough to remember this will know that that was an event that most of us thought we would never see. The Berlin Wall was a symbol of tyranny. It was it was a wall that held in a people and denied them freedom, denied them even access to their own families. You know, when the wall first went up, it went up so suddenly that there were people working in one part of Berlin who lived in the other. And or their kids were at school in one part of Berlin while they were at work in another, and the wall went up, boom. And if you were not with your family or loved ones or on the right side of that wall, it was too late and it was too bad. And I was, at that time, I was a young college student, a young undergraduate, and I worked in a chemical plant. I worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and then I went to class. This gives you a little glimpse into my life. I went to class. I had an hour commute, and I went to class from 8 a.m. To noon, and then I would drive home the hour, and I would sleep until 8, 9 o'clock. I would get up, get something to eat, and then I'd go to work. So I remember working in the laboratory of this chemical plant. I was quality control, and I had the radio on, and I was listening to the excitement, the joy, the tumult of the people who were on that wall. And, I'm young and I'm idealistic, and I'm thinking to myself, this is the life I want for me. I want to be a writer. I want to be on top of that wall. I want to be at events like this. Little did I know what my life would become. It's become all of that and more. But at that time, as a young undergraduate who's just trying to cast a vision, for his own life, that event was defining for me. This was a euphoric period of time. There's been nothing else like this that has united, the Western world. 9/11 is close in this regard, not in terms of epic defining, but it is close in terms of, at least with Americans. Americans became very, very united. It was not cool to criticize the United States or burn flags the way that it seems to be right now. Rudy Giuliani, who the left has absolutely demonized. Rudy Giuliani was a huge hero to New Yorkers, a huge hero to New Yorkers. This was a guy who led New Yorkers through this perilous period of time, and he did it with courage, and was a hero, rightly so for that. But the collapse of the Berlin Wall was an event that didn't just unite Americans; it united freedom-loving people all over the world, and it was a period of time that felt hopeful. It felt like the world was moving in a positive direction, that this was the domino theory in reverse, that rather than communism bleeding in to Eastern European nations and Africa and Asia and one country after another falling like dominoes to communism, that this was something very different, that this was going in the other direction, that countries were not falling to communism, but were standing up for freedom. And it was captured even in popular culture. And unfortunately, we can't play it for you. I did it some time ago on an episode of Ideas Have Consequences, and YouTube absolutely suppressed it because I guess you can't do it even as a news item. But I played a couple of songs from that era that captured rock songs, which usually their only themes are sex and drugs, to kind of capture the euphoria of the moment. And one of them was Eddie Money's Peace in Our Time. Now, if you're not familiar with that phrase, the phrase peace in our time was first used by Benjamin Disraeli in a declaration, Congress of Berlin, where he declared, we have peace in our time. Then it was used infamously, reused deliberately. He was familiar with Disraeli's use of it. A future British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, after he came back from Munich in 1938, he said, we have peace in our time. He was echoing the phrase of Disraeli to the euphoria of the British people that was very short-lived because they didn't have peace in their time as he seemed to think that they did. And so Eddie Money is singing, he didn't write it, but he's singing this song, Peace in Our Time. And the lyrics go something like this, and it resonated with the collapse of the wall. Never gonna break down the walls and build a prison with the stone, because you and I know what love is worth. We're gonna build a heaven on earth. Now, is there anything more idealistic, more utopian than that? But that was kind of the spirit of the age. It was this feeling that the Soviet Union, the big bad wolf, was dead, and freedom and democracy spreading. Never gonna break down the walls and build a prison with the stone, because you and I know what love is worth. We're gonna build a heaven on earth. Wow. I love that song. Then there was another song from that era by the Scorpions. The Scorpions. Now, if you don't know who the Scorpions are, at this stage of my life that I'm talking about here, when I'm, like maybe 21, 22, at this time I'm a little bit older than that. I would be, when Winds of Change came out, I would be a little bit older than that. But the Scorpions, if you're not familiar with them, they were the singers of the song "Here I Am," da-da, da-da, rock you like a hurricane. Da-da. That's them, song about sex, by the way. And they were also the singers of another headbanger song called "Somebody Like You." Somebody like you, I can't wait for the night with you. I imagine to think that's the Scorpions. That's the Scorpions. And then the Scorpions, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, they come along with this very thoughtful ballad. And listen to the lyrics. Again, "Somebody Like You," song about sex. "Rock You Like a Hurricane," song about sex. And then they have this. And this song, I guess they wouldn't have used the term then, but we'll use it now. This song went viral. This song was hugely popular, penetrated America. They were a West German rock band, so they knew about the wall. The wall cut them off from the other half of their city. So they were deeply affected by the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and they wrote this song. This song is called "Wind of Change." Now listen to these lyrics, how hopeful and idealistic these lyrics are. I follow the Moskva, the Moscow River. I follow the Moskva down to Gorky Park. Gorky Park is a huge park like Central Park in central Moscow. I follow the Moskva down to Gorky Park, listening to the wind of change. An August summer night, soldiers passing by, listening to the winds of change. And then you have this beautiful whistling. Again, I wish we could play the song for you, but YouTube won't allow us to do it. So you'll have to look it up and listen on your own if you're not familiar with them. The world is closing in, and did you ever think that we could be so close like brothers, meaning Germans and Russians who have traditionally hated each other? Is it possible, he's saying, that I as a German could be walking along the Moskva with soldiers nearby, and I'm enjoying this beautiful summer night, and we're brothers. We're brothers. This is the idealism of this period of time. The future is in the air. I can feel it everywhere, blowing with the wind of change. Take me to the magic of the moment on a glory night where the children of tomorrow can dream away in the wind of change. Walking down the street and distant memories are buried in the past forever. I follow the Moskva down to Gorky Park, listening to the wind of change. This is a beautiful song, and there's no wicked intention in this. That the idealism is misplaced in the sense that, this isn't achievable, but the idea, the desire, it's a heartfelt desire, a God-given heartfelt desire that sometimes we get little glimpses of in this life. It never lasts. It's like the mountain of transfiguration. You know, Peter got up there and enjoyed himself so much he just wanted to build, tenements, stay up there forever. Wouldn't we all? This life gives us little heavenly glimpses, but they fade. They wither, they perish, they simply cannot last. But it's a glimpse of something that will come, and it's a heartfelt desire. He's saying, the lead singer of the Scorpions, we're brothers. Such a wonderful feeling to be in Moscow, and yet here we are, 35 years later. And would any of these feelings, these sentiments be true? It's a beautiful sentiment. It's a beautiful, heartfelt desire. And so, by the way, is Eddie Money's Peace in Our Time. Again, going to build heaven on earth, not going to happen. That's a utopian idea that will not be achieved by humanity. But what I'm wanting you to understand is these utopian feelings of the time. This was the way that people felt. And a little bit more on Peace in Our Time, the lyrics. Oh, darling, how strong is love supposed to be? Surrounded by fire and magic, we long to be free. Cheating, heating up down on the streets of shame, to be strong enough to fly without love like a phoenix from the flame. You got to have faith to work it out. Faith and hope, without a doubt, give us strength to make a start, put a song in our heart. Then we're going to break down the walls. We won't build a prison with the stone because you and I know what love is worth. We're going to build a heaven on earth. And then he says we're going to turn water into wine. That's John 2. That's the wedding at Cana that he's referencing there. But again, it's this secular version of it. I know there's a biblical reference, but it's this secular feeling that we're winning and the world is becoming a better place. Now, part of what I want you to understand in this as I am making reference to this has all largely been forgotten today. It has largely been forgotten because the Soviet Union, as Boris Yeltsin was standing on tank, the Soviet Union collapsed. It crumbled. If you're not old enough to remember that, again, euphoric. The big bad wolf was dead. The Berlin Wall collapses, and then 2 years later, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. And as Boris Yeltsin was standing on tanks, the president of Russia, as he became, standing on tanks in an effort to prevent a coup attempt in Russia. I mean, those of us in the West were watching this and going, this is kind of wonderful in the sense that, not only is the big bad wolf is dead and no longer a threat to the West, but there's chaos in Russia. They have to focus on their own problems, and therefore they'll leave the rest of us alone because we perceived historically Russia as the threat, rightly so, since 1917, since the Bolshevik Revolution, certainly since World War II, the end of World War II, and the Stalin's march and occupation of Eastern Europe. I was boarding a plane going to London to study Russian history, European history, as Boris Yeltsin was standing on that tank. And I'm following all of this as a young man. I'm following all of this excitedly because it's the world that I'm studying and that I'm interested in. And by the way, the euphoria was expressed. I put here, I didn't face the titles towards you because I needed them to be faced towards me. The euphoria of the period is captured in books like this. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man. This was a massive bestseller, but Francis Fukuyama was arguing in this book that basically democracy had won. Now, he didn't seem to take into account that there was Asia, Africa, South America. There was still a battle to be fought. But the argument of the book, and this was a massive bestseller, because it was music to the ears of Westerners who wanted to believe this. It was not only is the Cold War over, but capitalism and democracy have won, have conquered. It's over. We have seen the end of history in the sense that there's no longer thesis, antithesis, freedom and dictatorship or tyranny, but now we are seeing synthesis. This one has conquered this one, and now it's just a matter of kind of mopping up operations. That's what it's going to be. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, his book here, these are books that I just pulled off of my shelf because I had to read them when I was a student and later as a graduate student. But this is his book, Perestroika, New Thinking for Our Country and the World. And listen to what it says on the cover by a Western Russian expert. This is an age of change, and Gorbachev has made himself its angel and its instrument. Meaning, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was hated in his own country because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the chaos that followed, Gorbachev's book was a bestseller in the West, and he was hugely popular in the West. And he was seen by some to be the most extraordinary leader of our time. So again, this book, Fukuyama's book, expresses the euphoria, the idealism of the period. And again, part of what I'm wanting you to see here is, remember, this is what happened after when the Soviet Union started to collapse, when it started to disintegrate, and then once it did disintegrate, there was this feeling of hopefulness that the world had changed. Who could have predicted that we would be where we are right now, on the verge of World War III? So Fukuyama, Gorbachev's book, I mean, here he is. An age of change. And Gorbachev has made himself its angel and its instrument. I mean, incredible language right there. Then we have Boris Yeltsin's book, also a bestseller in the West. Here it is, From Bolshevik to Democrat, hailing Boris Yeltsin as a kind of agent of change as well, and loved in the West, appreciated in the West. He was the last president of Russia before Putin, and he named Putin as his successor. So you have those two guys. Let me try to line these up here so you can see those titles. And then we have The New Russians by Hedrick Smith. Hedrick Smith was the Moscow bureau chief for, I don't think it was the New York Times, I think it was the Washington Post, back when the Washington Post did actual journalism. And Smith is a fascinating guy. His book, The Russians, which was a book that he had published in the 70s when he was stationed there. And now here he was saying his commentary on The New Russians. Again, all of these books are hopeful. These are all books that are saying, like the songs. So it went from the academy, from the academic world, trickled all the way down into pop culture, that everything was hopeful, euphoric. We're moving forward in a very positive way. And yet here we are on the verge of World War III. So what happened? Well, part of what happened here, and part of what I want you to understand, is that Russian experts in the West have generally been wrong, spectacularly wrong, in trying to understand Russia. It's fascinating to me that the end of World War II, 1945, the State Department had one Russian expert. Within a few years, it would be full of them, or at least people claiming to be Russian experts. But again, why is it that Russian experts and advisors to presidents, to policymakers in the West have so often been so wrong about Russia? Well, that comes back to part one of this series, of not understanding the Russian mind, that they don't think the way that we do. They do not have the same historical experience. They view their own situation very different than we tend to view it. They see us as the aggressors. We see them as the aggressors. They view Putin, for instance, right now, Putin's wildly popular in Russia. We speak of him in terms of Hitler or Stalin. And when I get to Putin, I'm going to explain to you who I think Putin actually is and what I think he's actually all about. We will get there. But understanding Russia has not been an easy thing for the West. And so the assumption after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I remember this period very well because I was in Russia. By the way, I bought the Scorpions' Winds of Change CD, a pirated CD in Red Square. In Red Square, when that song was hugely popular, here I was, a young, idealistic, hopeful, want to be eventually Russian scholar. And I'm thinking, this is incredible. Who would have ever thought that I would be standing in Red Square buying a pirated CD of a song that would probably have been deemed illegal under the Bolsheviks, under the communists. And yet here I am, buying it, rocking out on it as Russians themselves were at that time. And it was easy to be swept up in the moment to think that Russia was going to make the leap, the jump from tyranny, from communism, to a free market economy, to capitalism, and eventually to democracy of some sort. Because we were seeing it at the time in such places. In fact, I remember vividly, I was just in the Czech Republic recently after my narrow run-in with the Egyptian secret police in Cairo. But I was fascinated because I was going from Eastern Europe, that is former satellite countries at the time, multiple former satellite countries at the time, post-collapse of the Soviet Union, into Russia. And what you were seeing was that those countries were making the transition much more effectively, efficiently than were the Russians. So, for instance, Czech Republic has made that change somewhat effectively, though right now it doesn't look very good because they have a communist for president. But the Czech Republic was succeeding and succeeding wildly. Poland was succeeding and succeeding wildly. They were making that transition from communism to a Western-style democracy at that time. And the feeling was that Russia, they're a little behind, but they're going to catch up. Now, the Russians at this time, I think what they would say to you is, we were naive about the West. We were naive about the West because what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union was every kind that the Russians, many of them were so excited to be kind of welcomed into a community of free nations that they opened themselves up to all sorts of things, many of them evil, that came flooding into their country. And the Soviet Union, Russian government, though it was a tyranny, the Soviets themselves, Soviet citizens, were a fairly naive people. They weren't allowed to travel abroad for the most part, so they really didn't know what the West was like, other than second, third, fourth hand, maybe a movie that they're perhaps a TV show that they're allowed to see. So they're left by and large guessing, and they have in many cases an idealistic notion of what America actually was and is. And so suddenly pornography is pouring into Russia, which they didn't have a problem with before. You have missionaries, good ones, who are bringing the Christian faith in, but you also have those that are bringing in, Scientology, cults, things of this nature that the Russians, again, and the Russian government were fairly open to begin with until they began to get burned by them. And then they start thinking, whoa, 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 whoa. These are not things that we want to bring into our country. And then you have scammers, Western scammers who are coming in and taking advantage of. These were very real things. I experienced them. I saw them. And so Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, opens up and then begins to close. And it begins to close as Russians begin to become disillusioned with democracy. You see, democracy freedom requires, and I should say that they became disillusioned, not with democracy, with freedom, because freedom requires certain things that when you grow up with it, you're used to. You don't think about because it's just been what you've absorbed over the course of your life. It requires a time consciousness. Capitalism definitely requires that. It requires a work ethic. It requires self-reliance, self-motivation, a certain measure of independence, of making your own decisions. And Russians, suddenly faced with these kinds of things, didn't always respond very well. And they thought that the transition wasn't going to be as painful as it became. Wasn't great under the Soviets, but it suddenly, for a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was worse. The access to ordinary household goods and food, they became very scarce. Life was hard. Inflation of the ruble skyrocketed, kind of like the Renton mark after World War I, or people taking wheelbarrows full of cash to go and buy a loaf of bread. Russians found themselves in these kinds of circumstances and situations, and they were hating it. And it's kind of like the children of Israel starting to say, what has Moses done? Why has he brought us out here in the desert to die? We want to go back to Egypt. Yes, we were in slavery, but it wasn't as bad as this. There was a desire to go back. There was a nostalgia for the Soviet Union, which to the Western mind seems unthinkable. And then there was this feeling that the West had deceived them. Please understand, I'm not portraying the Soviet Union as the good guy. I'm merely trying to explain to you the way they perceive it and what their historical experience was. And I was in the country from time to time where you could experience it, you could feel it. That the initial euphoria that Russians had was now slowly being replaced by cynicism. That freedom wasn't everything that it was cracked up to be. And guys like Putin were waiting in the wings. The old diehards were waiting in the wings. The old communists. Putin, by the way, isn't a communist. Those who say that, you don't understand who he is at all. But Putin is a guy that that did feel that the freedom impulses post-collapse of the Soviet Union have brought chaos. And you see, in the Western mind, freedom is peace, it's stability, it's happiness. To the Russian mind, freedom means chaos. Freedom means the kind of sexual anarchy that they're seeing in the West. They're going, that's what freedom looks like. They look at the West and they see a BLM riot and they go, that's what freedom brings. They see the kind of chaos that's taking place throughout the Western world right now, largely funded by guys like George Soros or USAID money or something along those lines. And they go, not sure we want freedom. And it reminds me of a line in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. The most famous chapter of The Brothers Karamazov is called The Grand Inquisitor. And in The Grand Inquisitor, again, this is a book published in 1881, Dostoevsky says that the people, specifically the Russian people, who have freedom will say to their would-be masters, make us your slaves, but give us bread, feed us. That people will almost always, says Dostoevsky, be willing to exchange their freedom for security. And there's the balance that you have to think about. You see, Freedom means being willing to live with a certain measure of instability. In a police state, in China, do they have a lot of bombings? Do they have the kinds of chaos that we occasionally see in the West? They do not, and it's because it is a police state, it is a surveillance state. They control the people through a social credit system. It's order. In a country where you have actual freedom, you have to be willing to say, I don't want to live in a police state, and that means I'm willing to tolerate a certain measure of criminal activity and things that do happen as a result of people having freedom. It's what happens. The balance between freedom and security is a difficult one, and the Russians have tended to go in the direction of security. Make us your slaves, but feed us. And freedom over here looks chaotic to them. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, for the first decade, it was. It was utter chaos. Huge inflation. Not immediate access to goods. Yeltsin, whose book I have in here, it's very funny. Famously, when he visited the United States in the 1980s, late 80s, he wanted to see food distribution in the United States, and I think this was in Boston, and he was taken to just a regular supermarket. And he sees all the goods, lemons and cantaloupes and canned goods and milk and bread. And Yeltsin turns to his handlers and says, I know a Potemkin village when I see one. This isn't real. He was sure that it was all a setup, that they had brought in all these things to give him the impression that this is what food distribution looked like in the United States. And they tried to reassure him and say, no, this is real. This isn't fake. We can drive you to another one across town. I mean, these places are all over America. You can get whatever you want. He's like, yeah, right. Sure you can. That's a president of a country who had no idea what it actually looked like in a free society. So the Russians, having experienced the chaos of the 90s, began feeling nostalgia for the iron-fisted days of Stalin, of the Soviet Union, of a time when they were respected by the West as a country. They felt rejected by the West, not taken seriously, and treated as a child. And that began paving the way for a little-known KGB man by the name of Vladimir Putin. And we're going to have that discussion coming up in part 3 and probably part 4 of this series. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.